In this lesson, you're going to learn how to create a sources and uses schedule for a more advanced leveraged buyout model. Now, in the more basic model, we said that the purpose of a sources and uses schedule was to show us where the money is coming from to buy this company, and then where it's actually going to. And we said that the reason we need this is similar to the reason why when you're buying a house, going back to that analogy, what you pay for the house and how you finance it are not exactly as they seem, because you may have hidden fees. You may have brokerage fees, for example. You may have homeowners fees. You may have other types of fees and expenses that you have to pay for. And so with a sources and uses schedule, you're reflecting more precisely beyond just the equity value that you're paying for the company, beyond just the per share price and the amount of debt you're raising, how much in funds you actually need. So the way we're going to set this up is very similar to what we saw in the basic LBO model. On the sources side, we're going to finance this transaction primarily with debt and investor equity. So to start with, on the debt side, for term loan A, I'm going to link up to our debt assumptions. And I can actually just copy this formula down for the other tranches of debt. Now remember that we're leaving out the revolver here because we're assuming that this $2 billion revolver is undrawn at first. So there's nothing on the balance sheet. We only draw on the revolver and create debt there if we actually need to do so. One addition that we're going to make this time around is that we have this item for excess cash. Now the reason we have this going down to our operating assumptions is that, remember, we have 6.5 or 6.6 billion worth of cash currently, but we have a minimum cash balance of 5 billion. And so what we can do in this scenario is assume that a company can use some of its cash to actually finance the transaction. Now, we could actually go even beyond this, and we could assume that they can also use their 20 or 25 billion worth of short-term investments and then their long-term securities to also finance the transaction. But most of the time, you assume that only cash, the most liquid asset, cash on the balance sheet, is actually used to finance the transaction like this. Now, it may seem odd to you that we can assume the company uses its own cash to finance the transaction, but remember, this really goes back to the concept of enterprise value versus equity value. With enterprise value, we're reflecting the fact that the investors are getting a break. They're getting a bargain because they're getting some of the cash back when they buy the company. Well, this excess cash line item here is essentially having the same effect. We're not counting the company's entire cash balance here, but we are assuming that the investors here will get a break because it's the company's responsibility to come up with their own cash to pay for part of this transaction. And remember that with the debt as well, these are all the company's responsibility to repay. So it's not really that unusual. We're just assuming that they have a responsibility to repay debt, and they also have a responsibility to use some of their excess cash toward the transaction price. So for this number, I'm just going to go down to our operating assumptions, take the initial cash balance, anchor that, and then subtract the minimum cash balance. So we have that. Now for the equity value of the company, remember that investor equity we'll leave blank and come back to later on because this is going to depend on what our uses side of the schedule looks like. So for the equity value of the company, we're going to go up to the top under transaction assumptions, and we're going to go to the equity purchase price right there. For the advisory fees, I'm going to go up and link this to the equity purchase price, so 0.02% times the equity purchase price. In transactions like this, you link the advisory fees to the equity value, not the enterprise value, because the equity value is what is publicly known, what is published in newspapers, for example. Now for the financing fees right here, what I'm going to do is take our 79 billion of debt required plus the revolver, because we want to include the entire potential debt balance. Even though the revolver is not drawn yet, it still costs something to go out and raise the money from banks, so we want to include this in our financing fee calculation as well. So we'll take both those numbers and multiply by the 0.06%. And then for legal and miscellaneous fees, we're going to go up and link in directly to the 10 million there. So we'll sum these up. We see it's very close. It's about 100 million higher than the equity value because of all these fees. Now for the investor equity, remember that our assumption will be it's equal to the total uses minus the sources so far. So we're assuming that whatever we need to buy this company that we have not yet paid for will be the responsibility of the private equity firm to pay for with their own equity, with their own cash. So we're going to take total uses over here and then subtract our sources so far. So we have that, and now I'm going to sum this up. Now, one question you may have is, why is it that we're assuming that the investor equity has to be used to pay for these transaction fees? Because that's basically what we're doing here. We're saying that the private equity firm is going to pay for the advisory fees, the financing fees, and the legal and miscellaneous fees. And the answer is we don't have to do that necessarily, but usually with LBOs, the way it works is you assume a fixed amount of debt based on some type of leverage ratio, and then you assume that the investor equity number is the plug. We don't necessarily have to do this. We could add to this and add in an assumption that maybe instead of paying this extra 100 million with investor equity, we could do it with term loan A instead. So it's not required, but this is what you typically see in models, which is why I'm doing it like this here. Another question you may have is, why is it that we have capitalized financing fees? What do I mean by capitalized financing fees? Well, with advisory fees and with legal and miscellaneous fees, the assumption in most models is that you pay for these immediately, whereas with financing fees, these actually go on the balance sheet and are capitalized just like any other asset, which is why we have this new line item for capitalized financing fees right here. So we assume that these go on the balance sheet and then a certain amount is amortized, a certain amount is paid off each year. But the other fees are paid immediately. The logic for that is that advisory fees and legal and miscellaneous fees correspond to only the transaction itself, whereas financing fees correspond to debt, which can last for many years. So that's why you capitalize financing fees and why you expense advisory fees and legal and miscellaneous fees. So that's how we set up a sources and uses schedule for a more advanced LBO model. The concept is very similar to the more basic one, but we do have some more items here and some more details that we need to look at. Coming up in the next video, we're going to look at the goodwill and intangible asset calculation for an LBO model. And we'll see how we calculate asset write-ups, deferred tax liabilities, and related items, and how it is similar to what we saw in the merger model, but also how it's a bit different from what we've seen previously.